Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hello and welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today we are talking about what has happened from about mid-January to mid-February 2025 and what to expect from the FDA and customs. So, Ben, it's great to see you. Where are you now?
I'm in El Salvador. I'm here for several weeks. Not uncommon that I'll go someplace to go work, and doesn't matter where I'm working from. So I'm just in the beautiful weather of El Salvador right now.
Nice. All right. Well, it's. I woke up to -4 in Colorado right now. So.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, it's about 80 right here.
Okay. Well, that's better.
That's a disparity. I apologize.
That's okay. That's okay. I'll survive. I promise. Let's start here for any newcomers that might be, tuning into our podcast. Can you tell them a little bit about yourself and FDA-Imports.com?
My name is Ben England. I'm an attorney. I used to work for the Food and Drug Administration, was there for 17 years. While I was there, I also worked a lot with customs. My background is in science. I was a microbiologist first with the Food and Drug Administration. In early 2000s, I left the FDA, finally sort of made good on my threat, left the agency and started practicing law, representing companies that are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. And in many cases, they're foreign companies that export to the United States. And in other cases, they're the importers. So I work a lot with FDA, USDA, and customs in all FDA-regulated sectors. So foods, drugs, medical devices, cosmetics, dietary supplements, tobacco, really everything, animal food, everything FDA regulates. So that's my background. And I've been sort of in the space, both in terms of law and regulation, as well as policy related to FDA and customs for many, many years.
So let's dive in on hot topics today, the new tariffs, how they might affect FDA and USDA-regulated goods. Can you kind of I know it's a broad topic, but I'm just going to lay it out there and see what you got to say.
Sure. So there are some important things happened that the industry needs to know about. There were threats, of course, of tariffs against against Mexico and Canada, and both countries worked something out before those tariffs went into effect. That's a good thing. We talked last time. We had an update or podcast about the kinds of products that come from those countries. Today, we should probably talk mostly about China. China manufactures and ships to the United States many products regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, to include, for instance, seafood, pharmaceuticals. You might remember during COVID, there was a lot of talk about the fact that so much PPE, the personal protection equipment, masks and gloves, et cetera, were not made here. Those products, many of them are made in China. So medical devices, pharmaceuticals, all kinds of foods. Very recently, the Trump administration, they basically they put into place, instituted 10% tariffs across the board, everything that's coming out of China into the United States. So that's a 10% tax. That's a duty. It's a type of tax that's charged to the importer when the goods arrive. And so where Mexico and Canada, there may be more or less impact on consumers over time, because much of the products coming from Mexico and Canada tend to be a little bit more seasonal. With China, you've got a consistent flow generally of products coming into the United States. And so that 10% will be borne primarily by the combination of the importers and the manufacturers, and then ultimately the consumer. The kinds of products I think are very important here. For instance, about 80%, it's estimated, about 80% of pharmaceuticals that are consumed in this country are imported. Either the finished drug, right, the actual pill that you take, is made in another country, or what's called the active pharmaceutical ingredient, or the API, is manufactured in another country, and then that's imported and finished here, or it might be finished in another country entirely, go someplace else. China manufactures a substantial amount of the APIs of pharmaceuticals that are consumed in this country, whether it's over-the-counter drugs or prescription drugs, brand name pharmaceuticals, or generic pharmaceuticals. So it's just a very large portion of industry. And so that is probably one of the hardest issues that the industry will be dealing with respect to the tariffs. The reason for that is most of the cases, the desire is for manufacturing to come back to the United States, which is an admirable desire. It's a policy question. And irrespective, I could tell you that it's very difficult to successfully move a manufacturing operation for a pharmaceutical product anywhere. And the reason is that FDA, in the cases where the pharmaceutical, the drug, has to be approved by the FDA has to inspect the facilities that manufacture the API, that's the raw drug, and the finished dosage manufacturers And sometimes other players, sterilizers or laboratories doing testing, they might be inspected also by the FDA. Well, that takes time. So you're not going to be able to, you can't just shift your supply chain to Mexico or Canada or the United States. You have to have a place that FDA has inspected to manufacture that API or that finished drug. So that's going to take years to actually accomplish. So the 10% tariff that, to the extent that it affects pharmaceuticals, is not likely to produce a very rapid onshoring of pharmaceutical manufacturing. And so that's going to increase costs in the supply chain and ultimately to consumers. Other products, medical devices, for instance, have some of the same kinds of issues associated with them, but it's less so. FDA does inspect foreign medical device manufacturers, but at a much lower rate in terms of like numbers of facilities. And you don't often have this pre-inspection requirement in order for the medical device to be approved. You do sometimes, however, have that. And you do have a lot of Chinese medical device manufacturing. And so seafood is another good example when we use food as an example. China is one of the largest seafood producers in the world. And most of the seafood that the United States consumes is not domestically caught or processed. In fact, a lot of the seafood that's consumed here might be actually, say, a good example, Ecuadorian shrimp that goes all the way to China and gets processed and packed in China and then comes all the way back to the United States. And it's still cheaper than getting shrimp from the Gulf of America or Mexico, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of seafood that was already impacted. Much of that was already impacted by the earlier tariffs. Now, not all of it, but a number of this, say shrimp. Shrimp can come raw or it can come cooked or it can come what's called value added. That's where they might dip it in batter and then they put like some sort of a crust on it, some sort of breading or something on it.
Yeah, I love a good coconut shrimp.
Yeah, okay, there's a good example, right? Those two different kinds of shrimp were actually treated differently under the HTS system, the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, and consequently, they actually have different tariff rates just because they are more processed or less processed. And some of them are subject to the earlier 25% tariffs that Trump had originally put on China, and others are not. But all of them are subject to the 10%. So some of them now are 35 and others are 10. So that's some of the tariff issues, some of the issues related to that and how they affect some FDA products. And of course, then you've got cosmetics, you've got all sorts of things that are going. We have Valentine's Day that just passed. And so you can imagine all the candy that came into the United States, all the toys, all the beautiful hearts, all these things. And where does that come from? Well, it's not being made here. Some of the candy might be, but that's all that's coming from other countries and much of it from China. So as we go through holidays, you'll see as you come to Easter, there's going to be a lot of impact in terms of tariffs as products are coming in from China.
So what are people saying as far as is this going to continue? As far as the China tariffs go, I know there's a pause on the Mexico and Canada ones, but it seems like the Trump administration is using it as a bargaining tool. Do you see it changing, or do you see the tariffs staying put?
So my gut is that they're going to go up. I'm looking at the crystal ball here, but one of the reasons is that just last night, and when I say last night, we're now on February the 19th, so the evening of February the 18th, 2025. Trump floated the balloon of up to 25% tariffs on pharmaceuticals, as well as some other items, right? I picked an FDA-regulated product. And so that's an example to me that a view in my mind, if that happens, for instance, that would be all countries or many, many more countries and China, right? So China would already, even though many pharmaceuticals would have been exempt under the original 25%, they were hit by the 10%, and then they would be hit by another 25%. So that's 35% on pharmaceuticals. Whether it goes that high or not, all of the talk is still up, right? And all the rumor is up, right? You buy on rumor, you sell on news. Right now, it's all rumor is up, and it looks like that's probably the best bet right now. And unfortunately, so it's going to have impact. It's going to have impact on the consumers. The industry, the supply chain cannot absorb 25 to 35% duty. Mm-hmm. It has to pass that.
No, and it's not like drug costs are cheap. So that's not going to help things for sure.
Right.
There's some big news in the Department of Health and Human Services. There's a new secretary, and there's also layoffs at the FDA. Where are you seeing the FDA take hits? How is this affecting the operations? What are you seeing from the inside there?
Yeah, good question. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is now the Secretary of Health and Human Services. HHS is over the CDC, it's over NIH, it's over the Food and Drug Administration. And so right off the bat, there were firings that were going. I can tell you that the majority of those firings had to do with what are called probationary employees, or employees at the federal government who had been hired within the last year. Those employees always are easier to let go under federal law. So they're the easiest to release, and consequently, they were the first to go. There's problems with that. There's lots of problems with all that any kind of firing that's this sort of firing, where it's just sort of mass. It's not very surgical, and consequently, you can certainly end up firing people that you actually need. A good example has to do, recently there was in the news about firings of 300 people at a nuclear regulatory agency group that is responsible for reviewing the stockpile, and they had to be hired back. And that's the kind of thing that can happen when you fire this way, right? You don't have visibility deeply enough into the agency to know what the actual impact is likely to be. Now, in the Food and Drug Administration, most of the probationary people, the people that were hired on recently, where I would see the biggest impact, has to do with those in the Center for Devices that are in the review space. They're reviewing medical device filings for submission to the agency for approval or for clearance. And they had just ramped up hiring for the experts, people with experience with AI, hospitals that use AI in order to choose which medical device and which pharmaceuticals would arguably be subject to FDA jurisdiction as well. And so when you release those with that many people, and there's that much technology coming on the market, the agency now is behind industry. Right. And that's not a good place to be for a regulatory agency of products that are this complex and could have a significant impact on public health and certainly individual outcomes with respect to patient treatment. So those kinds of mass firings are not very useful. And it's largely because it's difficult to see deeply enough into the agency to know what the likely impact would be of that kind of a fire. Turning to foods, another example of that, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been very vocal about the chemicals that are in the food supply in the United States.
Right.
Well, foods, things that are added to food are regulated under what's called regulations that are called generally recognized as safe, which means that they're GRAS, right? GRAS. So it's not grass like two other kinds of grass it could be, right?
I was going to say.
Right? No, it's generally recognized as safe. Now, pharmaceuticals are regulated under a standard called generally recognized as safe and effective. So they're GREAS. Now, what happens is they created a system that allows industry to bring ingredients for food use far more easily and rapidly as additives than, say, in the 1980s. And arguably, it's about then when you started to see a substantial increase of these additives. And FDA has a group of people that reviews petitions or notifications to the agency about the intent to use chemicals in food. And quite a number of people in that group were released, including, and then Jim Jones, one of the assistant directors in the Human Foods Program and at the Center for Foods, at the FDA. And he resigned yesterday. And largely his point is, I cannot do anything to protect the public at the Food and Drug Administration if I don't have the staff. And FDA just lost the staff. I also think that most of the impact is going to be in headquarters. It won't be in the field. It won't be inspectors. It won't be compliance officers in the field. They're still going to do inspections. They're still going to be reviewing products that are manufactured in the United States and products that are imported, right? So the field handles all the import operations. So there's inspectors, there's sample collectors, there's laboratories, there's compliance officers in the field. And for the most part, they'll be probably untouched unless they happen to be like probationary, like hired recently. And there could have been some ramp up, but you could lose some of those people. Sure. But for the most part, the impact would be in headquarters. And it's because they can go after most easily probationary employees, which are a year or less, and then employees that are in slots that are slated above G15s and higher. So these are the higher policy positions, senior executive service or SES, and then senior policy advisors. Those are more like they're appointed positions largely. They're not career positions. So those people are easier to fire too, because they serve basically at the pleasure of the commissioner or the secretary. So that's what I'm saying. I think you might see some walking back in the medical device space with respect to AI. And I think the two spots I mentioned, that the food additives, those that review these chemicals before they're used in food, and then the AI folks on the medical device side. The pharmaceutical side for reviewers, that is mostly paid for by user fees, right? So that's not paid for by taxpayers directly. That's sort of paid indirectly because for different reasons of how that works for the economy. I wouldn't expect to see too much impact on medical devices and pharmaceuticals that require clearance or approvals, because that's governed largely both brand name pharmaceuticals and generic are covered by an entire user fee program where FDA obtains the resources to hire people to do those reviews.
Wow. Certainly lots to keep our eyes on. Well, thank you for joining us on FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance with Attorney Benjamin L. England. To connect with Ben, visit FDAImports.com and be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Ben, thanks so much for being here and giving us a real-time updates here on a very important topic.
Yep. Great to see you, Kevin. Thanks very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.